Grand Rising, you beautiful people. It is Friday, the 31st of October, 2025. Welcome to Wake Up Investigates, our weekly in-depth look at a matter of public interest. And I would like to say, first of all, thank you so much, Sticky Marks, for that very early super chat. You are an absolute star. Sticky Marks wrote, "When the love of power becomes the power of love, then we will know peace," which is a Jimi Hendrix quote. Love from this crazy old lady-ish in Yorkshire. Thank you. You're an absolute star and I appreciate it. I truly do. Welcome to the show that knows it's only a matter of time before we strip all royal parasites of their titles. But first, we must defund the media establishment that holds them aloft. And let's start right here today. Thank you for being here. I truly appreciate it. Wherever you're watching us, whether you're on YouTube, Rumble, X, or Spotify, your participation, your involvement is deeply, deeply appreciated. And hello to you all in the chat. All, I hope you are well. I can see that they're talking about what's going on in the skies this morning. I hope you're well. As I say, this week I received an email from TV licensing. It was ominous and sinister. It said, "Are you watching live programs?" I don't have a TV license, and I haven't for, I would say, roughly a decade. I will not fund what they are selling. I abide by the rules, even though I know they are absolutely wrong. You must have a TV license to watch live TV or anything on BBC iPlayer. I do not watch live programming on my devices. That essentially covers any live programs at all. I have long been a critic of the BBC, even when I appeared on it as a journalist and commentator. These days, I refuse all invitations to appear in any of their output, be that TV or radio. Here's one of my BBC passes, actually. You can see, there you go, Sonia Poulton, BBC visitor. I was only ever there as a freelancer, which is why what I'm about to talk about didn't actually apply to me, but I'll get to that. So I appeared previously because I thought it was good to get different perspectives on the Beeb, but you never really do, not really, because the BBC was not set up to get to the truth, but as a government media arm to assist establishment propaganda. That is the reality. So in order to understand the present, I always like to go back. The British Broadcasting Company was set up as a public company on the 18th of October, 1922. The British government had already seen the power of propaganda in its radio broadcasts after World War I. Added to that, radio as a means of conveying a mass message was a significant tool in the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. And the British government recognized this. And the British government also recognized that there was, for them, a more efficient model needed than what was coming from America, which was this commercial free for all. That would not do for England. Oh, no, no, no. Our information needed to be more tightly guarded by the gatekeepers of the British establishment. The British government were anxious to maintain control over communication, including what was on message and what would influence masses of people. That is the beginning of the BBC, and nothing has changed. In her book, Power Without Responsibility, Jane Seaton talks about the BBC's monopoly and why it was created. And to quote her directly, she said, "Because the government were concerned that the new medium might interfere with the security and military use of the airwaves, and also believed that a publicly owned company might be more reliable against subversion." Oh, yes, indeed. Curiously, very curiously, the Prime Minister at the time was one of these fellows, David Lloyd George. He'd been Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1916 to 1922. He left office 4 days after the BBC was established and was replaced by Bonar Law as PM. There was discontent within the Conservative Party, which under Lloyd George, they felt it was becoming too liberal, and it led them to bring Bonar Law out of retirement, force Lloyd George to resign, an election to be called, and Bonar Law made Prime Minister. And it was David Lloyd George who issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Yes, indeed, It was this disgusting human being who played a role in the Zionist settlements and bloodshed that we see in Palestine. So Andrew Bonar Law replaced him and was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from October 1922 to May 1923. And it was under these conditions that the government media was launched. The BBC's first broadcast was on November the 14th, 1922. It was broadcast from Marconi House in the Strand. And obviously, well, not obviously, because you may not know, but the BBC has long ago moved from there. It was read by Arthur Burrows, the director of programmes. And immediately you can see that they were trying to work out how best to essentially mass entice the population. So what they did was to gauge what was the listener preference. The news was read twice, once at a normal speed and again more slowly. They were already working out how best to program viewers in order to receive the messages they sought to convey right from the start. Right from the start. The first broadcast from Manchester and Birmingham occurred the following day on November the 15th, 1922. By 1927, the BBC had become a public corporation financed by a licence fee, which over 100 years later forms a major part of the corporation's income. So let me talk about this man and his quite astonishing major role. This is, or rather was, Sir John Charles Walsham Leith, first Baron Leith, Scottish broadcasting executive and the corporation's first leader. In 1922, he was employed by the BBC, then the British Broadcasting Company Limited, as its general manager. In 1923, he became its managing director. And in 1927, he was employed as the Director General of the British Broadcasting Corporation, which had then been created under a royal charter. His concept of broadcasting was designed to, as he thought, as he believed, as he said, to educate the masses. And it marked for a long time the BBC and similar organisations around the world that followed the same model. Leith established the same principles that continue to guide the BBC to this very day. The impact of Sir John Leith cannot be underestimated. The BBC say that they aim to follow the Leithian directive to inform, educate and entertain. Nothing on there says to propagandize, but that is what the BBC was set up for. Oh, yes, indeed. But you can't just deliver undiluted propaganda on people without them feeling that they're also being entertained or educated in some way. And so you can see, very clever model, very clever indeed. Leith wasn't without his controversies, as you might imagine. There was a great deal of opposition to the commercial elements of the BBC, even though we don't see it at all as commercial, but it truly is. And Leith used the BBC to promote his own austere and sort of paternalistic worldview, which many compared to authoritarianism. Yes, indeed. And critics accused him of ruling by fear and overestimating his own abilities. But 103 years later, and his charter, what he was there at the forefront for the BBC to create, it still stands. So I don't think that's underestimating him. I think the fact is that the BBC, where it is in 2025, is exactly where it was in 1922. That is the reality. And we are told, aren't we, that the BBC is part of our great British culture, that it's the backbone, it's traditional. But is it really? Is it really? BBC has played a prominent role, certainly, in British life and culture. We've even kind of, people hold it with some affection. It's referred to as the Beeb or Auntie. It has an air of trust and respectability that has been fooling the masses since the start. In 1923, the BBC launched Radio Times, which was the first broadcast listings magazine. The 1988 Christmas edition sold 11 million copies, huge amount. The biggest selling edition of any British magazine in history. But that was 1988. That should tell us something, that the peak popularity of the BBC has long gone, and yet people are still forced to finance it. So the Royal Charter, are you familiar? The BBC operates under a Royal Charter. The Charter is this sort of constitutional basis for the BBC and sets out the BBC's object, mission, and public purposes. The idea is that it is supposed to emphasize public service, editorial independence. Try not to laugh as I'm saying this. It prohibits advertising on domestic services, and it proclaims the BBC is to seek to avoid adverse impacts on competition which are not necessary for the effective fulfillment of the mission and the promotion of the public purposes. A lot of management speak. The Charter additionally sets out that the BBC is subject to an additional agreement between it and the government department for culture, media and sport, and that it has an operating license which is regulated by Ofcom, which is an external broadcasting regulator. BBC used to mark its own homework, but that changed in 2017 when Ofcom took over regulation from the BBC Trust. The current charter took effect on the 1st of January 2017 and is set to expire on the 31st of December 2027, which is a perfect time and opportunity to defund the BBC. Which brings me to this, the licence fee. The TV licence fee primarily funds the BBC. It's an annual tax charged to all British households, companies and organisations using any type of equipment to receive or record live television broadcasts or use the BBC streaming service iPlayer, as I'd already outlined. The fee is set by the British government. It's agreed in Parliament and is used to fund the BBC's radio, TV and online services covering the nations and regions of the UK. Since 2014, it has also funded the BBC World Service, which broadcasts in 28 languages and provides TV, radio and online services in Arabic and Persian. Some of the BBC's revenue comes from its commercial subsidiary, BBC Studios, which sells BBC programmes and services internationally and also distributes the BBC's international 24-hour international English language news service from bbc.com. The license fee is wrong, was always wrong, but in 2025, there is no possible justification for it. It is wrong that every Brit who seeks to watch any live programming, including on streaming and the internet, must pay a tax that is given to the BBC. What people tell me when I've said defund the BBC, and you get people coming at you on social media and they say, no, we want the BBC because it's impartial, joke, and there's no advertising. Well, if you want to fund the BBC, that is your prerogative, because many people fund other outlets such as Amazon Prime or Netflix or any other broadcasting platform. The rest of us don't want to pay for a culture that over time has revealed itself to be about two main things: propaganda and predators. That is the reality. That is very much the reality. And I will outline it. I've already started to, in terms of the propaganda. You can't get more of a propaganda media arm than it being set up by government in the first place, right? But the reality is popularity is dwindling, and it's dwindling fast. In 2023, around 500,000 UK households cancelled their TV licence because viewing has shifted. That is the reality. And people don't want to pay to fund the BBC. Most people don't. I believe that the people who attack me online for saying defund the BBC are almost certainly shills. But as a result, the BBC has seen a decline in revenue, and the households now paying the licensing fee amount to around 23.9 million at the last count. So there is a significant reduction in it, and that will continue. Oh yes, it will indeed. The license fee is classified as a tax, and evasion is a criminal offence. Since 1991, collection and enforcement of the license fee has been the responsibility of the BBC in its role as TV licensing authority. The BBC carries out surveillance, most of it using subcontractors like Capita, on properties, and that is under the auspices of the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000. It may conduct searches of a property using a search warrant. License fee evasion makes up around 1/10 of all cases prosecuted in magistrates' courts, representing 0.3% of court time. You can't be sent to prison. This is what they tell us. But there is evidence just this isn't actually true. But they tell us you can't be sent to prison for failing to pay your TV license. Though if you fail to pay the fine for not having a TV license, you can be sent to prison. So really, you can. The reality is, yes. And revenue, in terms of revenue, the BBC has the second largest budget of any UK-based broadcaster. Over the last decade, it has been operating on approximately 5 billion a year. And it's extraordinary money, really. And revenue in 2024, rather, the revenue for the BBC was 5.38 billion. The net income was 229 million, and the total assets of the BBC is 1.97 billion. It's a hugely profitable organisation selling us propaganda and predators. So the history of propaganda, as I say, the BBC is the ultimate tool of the British establishment. It is incapable of holding power to account because it has been built to be compromised by the British government. The BBC, as I say, was built for government propaganda. Nothing has changed. And even though the BBC celebrated its 103rd birthday this month, it is essentially still the same beast. People on the right wing of politics say that the BBC is woke and it is full of such agendas. People on the left wing of politics say the BBC supports the British establishment and the status quo. But here's the thing, they're both right. The BBC is woke. It supports those agendas, but it also supports the establishment and the status quo. It certainly does. So both the left and right wing on this occasion are right. There you go. The BBC trades on the notion of impartiality, but this is an absolute lie. They claim the corporation is neither political or biased, but it has a shameful history of being both. It showed its hand early on in 1926 when miners' strike kicked off and what would then become the 1926 general strike. The BBC didn't allow any union voices, not even Ramsay MacDonald, the leader of the opposition Labour Party, onto the airwaves. And as Director General, actually, Sir John Leith wrote in his diaries, they want to be able to say that they did not commandeer us, but they know that they can trust us not to be really impartial, because that is the reality. Now, that's the foundation, and nothing has changed ever since. BBC is biased in favour of business. It's a documented fact that the BBC has long been pro-business and anti-union and anti-working class. This has been seen in studies and analysis, including the 2008 including after the 2008 financial crash. And a study found that pro-business voices had dominated BBC coverage, while trade unionists were largely absent, sidelined. And across a range of themes, researchers concluded that, in quotes, BBC tends to reproduce a conservative, Eurosceptic, pro-business version of the world, not a left-wing, anti-business agenda. And that is the reality largely. But as I say, it is considered to be very left-wing in terms of all of the assortment of genders, including the queer agenda, which I will get to, Black Lives Matter and all that sort of stuff. That's very much at the forefront of the BBC. In terms of bias, BBC News output is absolutely categorically the worst. It prides itself on its commitment to what it calls due impartiality, the provision of a wide range of perspectives on any subject without taking sides. But these are false equivalences and should not be, and all sides are equal. There are issues where you simply cannot be impartial. Certainly, in matters of worldly justice. It's a terrible position to conduct journalism from this position that all sides are equal. But that's how the BBC does it. There are wrongs and rights in this world, and the role of journalism should not be to fawningly repeat government demands like automaton, but to question them. The BBC do not do that because, as said, it's not in the DNA of the BBC. A brief reminder, it was set up to accommodate government messaging. This was frankly dramatically highlighted by academic research that found that the BBC had the most pro-war agenda in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. 11% of all sources quoted by the BBC were drawn from the coalition government or from the military. By far the highest proportion of all domestic broadcasters, with the lowest amount of coverage of Iraqi casualties. That continues today in regards to Israel and Palestine, more of which shortly. And a lot of my information has been garnered because I have first-hand knowledge of how they operate. About 10 years ago, plus roughly, approximately, I was given access to a BBC laptop. It was during the period, so actually it's probably closer now to about 13 years, but 10 years plus, say. It was during the Cameron-Clegg coalition government, and they had introduced George Osborne, the Chancellor, but all of them had introduced ideological austerity. This was an absolute attack on sick and disabled people. Unquestionably, it was also at the same time they were pushing through the part privatization of the NHS, and I had access to this BBC laptop, and in it there was correspondence between the Cabinet Office and the BBC, in which the Cabinet Office were telling the BBC what they could and couldn't say regarding government cuts and expenditure. So unquestionably, still being steered by government, and nothing has changed in the last decade. No, I know it hasn't. And this was the first point. The ideological austerity, by the way, there should have been a massive pushback by the BBC. The BBC is supposed to represent the people. It doesn't. It represents government and it represents private interests. But there should have been a massive pushback by the BBC against ideological austerity, because it was an absolute attack on people, and certainly the most vulnerable amongst us. And the BBC failed every way round. And in the last decade, they have become more government-centred than rarely seen before, and they have lied about the political destruction of the National Health Service, about the poverty in this country. They lied about COVID-19 and all aspects of it. And to top it off, they push the gender cult and routinely depict male attackers as women. It is not an organisation to be trusted with telling the truth, not at all. And, you know, the BBC has worked with the UK state repeatedly to advance key foreign policy objectives. The BBC's monitoring service in Caversham acts as some kind of proxy information source for the military. Researchers say in 2014, it was generating material for the British intelligence services that was made available only to a select group of senior BBC journalists. World Service broadcasts, as I said, in some 42 languages and is supported by the Foreign Office. What a fantastic way to spread propaganda. In 2021, the Foreign Office gave BBC World Service £94 million. That's the last amount that I could find, but that's continued. It funds it yearly. And when it handed over that cash of our money, it said that the BBC will build on their great work upholding global democracy through accurate, impartial and independent news reporting. How can you possibly be calling it independent news reporting when you're handing over £94 million to them? That's the point. The point is that we've had the BBC. Everybody who is alive today has had the BBC in the UK, has had the BBC in their lives all their life, actually around the world, because it has reach all around the world and is respected all around the world. So we have been influenced by the BBC throughout our entire lives. And it's time that it was absolutely defunded. The establishment bias on the BBC is clear for all to see. You know what makes me sick is when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister and the whole thing kind of erupted about Russia and Ukraine. I was a regular contributor to Russia Today. And one of the first things that they did was they shut down the London bureau of Russia Today. But the irony, of course, is that the BBC is a far bigger state broadcaster than Russia Today. They wanted Russia Today out of the way, not because of the Russia-Ukraine war, but because Russia Today was the only media organisation based in the UK that was properly taking to task what was happening in government, because the BBC absolutely will not do it. And if you see any what appears to be anti-government stories on the BBC, it's because that will be a lesser than. It will be a replacement for something that could be much worse, because they have to look as if they are impartial. Certainly when it comes to the government, but I can assure you, absolutely not. And, you know, you see that often, don't you? The way that they uphold royalty, as one example. When it was the Queen's death, it was wall-to-wall coverage. It was frankly akin to a fanzine. There is extreme royal bias there. And the BBC was always going to be quite major when it came to Operation London Bridge, which was the announcement of the death of Queen Elizabeth. And it was actually like this kind of militarized production in preparation for the death of the Queen. It involved combining network coverage and insisting that listeners to Radio 4 and Radio 5 Live would hear the words, "This is the BBC from London." And the idea was that it was designed, they had this idea that, like in wartime, it would summon the spirit of the nation together. Only problem is, it was this chap who was chosen to do it. And Huw Edwards, a man who at the time was receiving obscene images from a 17-year-old junkie in return for money, as well as abuse images of children from a paedo. So yes, then as now, the BBC is not representative of the British public, and they thrust royal and establishment coverage on us, and delivered by a predator like Huw Edwards. We need a media that sincerely holds power to account and is genuinely independent of the state and of the market. The BBC is not the one. No, indeed. And I will come back to Huw Edwards, because you know I will. In addition to its establishment foundation, the British Secret Services at MI5 vetted staff for some 60 years, from the 1930s to the 1990s, for their political views, seeking to weed out radicals and dissidents. It was based in the Special Duties Office at the Corporation Office. Senior BBC staff worked in secrecy with the security services to make sure that radical voices were either excluded or carefully watched. And in 1933, BBC executive Colonel Alan Dornay began to meet the head of MI5, Sir Vernon Kell, and they were trading information. And so from 1935 onwards, there was this formal arrangement whereby job applicants would be secretly vetted by MI5 for their political views. The job applicants, this was done without their knowledge, by the way. And this was all denied until 1989. The BBC took up a policy of denying any suggestion by the press, by any journalists, of such a relationship. In fact, the very existence of MI5 itself was not officially acknowledged until the Security Service Act of 1989. But vetting was finally revealed by investigative journalists in the 1980s, slightly prior to that, and officially ended, we were told. in the 1990s, by which time thousands of potential and actual BBC staff had been subject to totally unacceptable and unaccountable levels of intrusion. Some of the biggest names that were vetted would have included household predators such as Jimmy Savile. But it was okay. He was subversive to the state because he was also supplying children to members of it. And it is quite extraordinary what was going on. And, as I say, it was sort of busted in 1990. And so it's not far-fetched at all. And by the way, one of the people that they almost certainly would have vetted as well would have been this man, David Icke, when he was a presenter on Match of the Day, former footballer. So he would have certainly been vetted, but would have been found to be okay because they weren't vetting their freelance staff. They were only vetting their in-house staff, and he would have been one of them. And he, of course, left the BBC and then kind of turned on it, as any sensible person should do. But yes, they would have certainly vetted him. And, the fact is they would have vetted the other predators. We'll come to the convicts and the predators. They would have all been vetted, and they were all found to be okay. That is the reality. So it isn't far-fetched to describe prominent TV people as working for the state, as being shills, because they almost certainly were and are. They wouldn't be there in the first place if they didn't. Nobody can tell me that just because the whole thing of MI5 vetting was busted in the 90s, that it all stopped. Absolutely no way. They are still vetting, unquestionably. And you know what? Sometimes you can tell. You can tell when sometimes we are able to catch the BBC at their propagandist best. And I think this has to rank as one of them. Absolutely. This, of course, was BBC News correspondent Jane Stanley. And she announced in a live report that the World Trade Center 7 had collapsed, even though it was still visibly standing behind her. And the Reuters news service quickly got into action and said that it had mistakenly reported the collapse of the building, which was picked up by the BBC and by CNN just before the live report. Reuters later issued a correction. But here's the thing, is they all work together. And I wrote a story about a man who refused to pay his TV license because of this incident with Jane Stanley and what happened, right? Because it clearly shows us that the BBC had some kind of prior knowledge that the World Trade Center 7 building was going to collapse. That's what it clearly shows us. So this man refused to pay his TV license, and he was taken to court. He was taken to magistrate court, and his defense was this report. And he said, and actually the article I wrote made the front page of the Sunday Express, because the man argued in court that the BBC was not delivering the truth and he refused to fund it. And he was not fined. He was not fined based on this report. Even a magistrate realized there was a problem with the BBC and propaganda. And of course, it would be absolutely remiss of me not to comment on their COVID-19 coverage. It has to be one of the biggest acts of treason against the British public that I've witnessed in my lifetime. Wholeheartedly supported by the BBC, they lied constantly, including fabricating about full hospitals. And I was a news reviewer at the BBC during COVID-19, primarily on the Stephen Nolan show on Radio 5 Live. And I saw from the inside how it all came about. Stephen Nolan immediately adopted an extreme reaction as early as late January 2020. And I couldn't quite believe it. I was on there as a news reviewer, and there was this host who was like, it's all going to be insane and there's going to be many problems. And week after week after week, he kept going on about lockdown, about masking up. And I was like, I think this is all becoming too extreme. We don't need to be like this, because if we carry on like this, we'll all be locked down. And I said this before we were all locked down. But I watched how they did it from the inside. It was the extreme ramping up of the narrative. And the irony, of course, with a man like Stephen Nolan. Have I got an image of Stephen Nolan? Probably don't need to, actually. He has slightly changed now. But at the time, he was extremely obese. And I mean extremely obese, but he was obsessed with public health. Since then, he shed many stones. I don't know whether it's Ozempic. I don't actually care. All I know is a lot of the stuff that came out of his mouth was absolutely state propaganda, state narrative. Much has been said about Stephen Nolan, including the fact that he's one of the BBC's highest earners, referred to as one of the broadcaster's bigger beasts. Was said by staff to be a law unto himself because he's so powerful within the corporation. There have been a number of allegations about Stephen Nolan over the years, including allegations that he sent sexually explicit images of a reality TV personality, Stephen Bear, who had been on Big Brother, to two members of his staff, and he warned colleagues that more images of Stephen Bear's genitals would follow if they failed to book Stephen Bear for Stephen Nolan's TV show, Nolan Live. And Stephen Bear was jailed eventually for voyeurism and 2 counts of revenge porn, but was before that booked onto Nolan's show, where he stripped off and posed in his underwear with Nolan. And that's kind of like some idea of Stephen Nolan. I also flew once to Stephen Nolan's, I think it's in Belfast. I'm not sure, I can't remember now. I think it's in Belfast. Stephen Nolan's TV show, and I did his TV show as well. And actually, John McCririck, the TV racing pundit at the time, he actually stripped down to his shorts as well. So clearly something that Stephen Nolan quite enjoys. And these days, much of the propaganda is conducted through the BBC Verified Disinformation Team arm. This is the most well-known face of that department, Marianna Spring, the BBC's first disinformation reporter, who, she awful individual, targeting people, including Richard D. Hall, which I'll get onto shortly. But an absolute awful individual, has all the hallmarks of a die-in-the-wall asset. Came pretty much from nowhere. And we were told that the official story was that she put in a call to the BBC, and that was received by Emily Maitlis. Emily Maitlis being the former presenter of BBC Newsnight, who did that infamous interview with Prince Andrew. But we are told this is what got Marianna Spring into the BBC. Absolute bunkum. Nobody can convince me that that is the truth, because BBC has extensive training programs, and this young woman almost came from nowhere. And it's quite interesting. I've done a deep dive into her before in my Gatekeeper series, so I'm not going to go too much into her, and it's available on YouTube. And I'll put a link in the description after this show. But she is a very toxic individual indeed. But even though she targets people, as I say, like Richard D. Hall, like Kate Shemirani, the recent stuff on Kate Shemirani, commentator Kate Shemirani, I think toxic nurse, the nurse in a toxic world, I think that's what she goes under, and the death of Kate's daughter Paloma. Well, Marianna Spring led the charge to absolutely attack and demonize Kate Shemirani, and it was some really ugly stuff. And it was also Marianna Spring who led the targeted attack and assault on researcher Richard D. Hall. There is no way that Richard D. Hall would have ended up in court if the BBC hadn't targeted him. And they did this program which was called Disaster Trolls, and they went after people. Her big thing is going after people who were like quote unquote conspiracy theorists, but she cannot take it herself. And here's why I say that. When I started to realize more and more about this young woman and realized how problematic she was, and I literally just tweeted her once on Twitter. I wasn't abusive. I asked her about when her department was going to start to look at BBC's own disinformation, and she blocked me. But then I received a email, I've got it in front of me, at 11:20 at night. It was Wednesday, the 17th of February, 2021, from her boss, Mike Wendlin. And I'm going to read it to you. It said, "Hi, Sonia. I'm Marianna Spring's boss at the BBC, and I see that you've tweeted about her work. I didn't want to respond publicly, and I'm a bit unclear about what exactly you were referring to in the message, but I'm happy to have a chat with you if you wish." And he attached his number. He said, "I'd appreciate if you could keep that number private." Of course, I am a journalist with integrity. I'm not a BBC journalist, so of course I would keep his telephone number private. And I just responded saying I was actually shocked that her boss felt it appropriate to contact me for a private conversation, because that's what they do to get people on side. I bet you, I actually said, I'm only going to have a private conversation with you if I can fully and extensively quote it. And I bet you that's how they go about it. As the moment that they see that there are people in some position, so yeah, I'm a public figure, the moment they see people in some position launching any opposition to Marianna Spring and BBC Verified, they contact these people privately to get them on side. I bet you he'd have offered me work. I bet you. But that's not how I operate. I don't operate on these private conversations and handshakes, not at all. And by the way, before we fully get to Huw Edwards, on the day the BBC were informed about the Huw Edwards allegations, guess where he was? He was at a do in Oxford with Marianna Spring. You can actually see him in this picture. Marianna Spring is in that really weird green and yellow and weird dress. She always dresses weird. She always dresses like some kind of throwback from kind of Tudor days or Elizabethan days. Really weird for a young woman. I don't think she's even 30 yet. And Huw Edwards is in the background. But that was the day that BBC were informed about the Huw Edwards allegations, and they were at this function in Oxford. So I think that's interesting. I think anything like that is interesting and potentially telling. So Marianna Spring's main role at the BBC was the BBC's disinfo reporter. And as I say, her brief is to tackle online misinfo, but she's BBC Verify is the BBC's fact-checking service. Oh, how I laugh. And that oversees a team of dozens of people. Last count, it was 60 people. And she seems to have a lot of responsibility and made progress in a very short period of time for a girl from nowhere. She hasn't had a chance to work her way up. She started at the BBC in a senior role as an inexperienced journalist. And as an experienced journalist, it's absolutely clear to me that she was placed there. And that is precisely why she first came to my attention. She is portrayed as Miss Nice, but she's really nasty, or at least her output is. She was the head girl at Sutton High School in southwest London, and she was chosen not only to be a ball girl at the famous annual Wimbledon tennis competition, but to give flowers to Queen Elizabeth II. You don't get chosen to do those kind of things unless you've already been marked out for some reason. She went to grammar school. She was involved in a young journalist program. She studied French and Russian at Oxford University. She spent a year in Russia, and she undertook work experience at The Guardian and Private Eye. And as I say, the official story is that she entered the BBC via a referral from a Guardian journalist to the BBC Newsnight presenter Emily Maitlis. And I don't believe that for 1 second. And Emily Maitlis, as you will see, also is at the centre of so many BBC stories, even though she left the BBC now and now works for, I think it's LBC Global, for their news agents daily podcast. And but you know, Marianna Spring, Miss Disinformation, and she supports everything unthinking and everything that bought journalism supports. She is climate change, you know, push. For her, there are no issues with the official narrative of 9/11 as an example. She's targeted and attacked people who questioned vaccines, and it's really quite egregious the way she behaves, but her main role is to censor the internet and part of cancel culture. Her team and her are absolutely hell-bent on censoring the internet. They proudly boast about contacting platforms about individual accounts. Since when has that been the remit of a BBC reporter? And they've done that. They've had accounts removed, including on TikTok and X. It's extraordinary to me. And you know how you can tell absolutely that she has been placed there is because when it came to C19, she got to interview Anthony Fauci. And obviously she didn't challenge him. She treated him like the second coming. And the reason why a Marianna Spring gets to interview an Anthony Fauci is precisely because of the ineffectiveness of her questions. She also wrote a book on being a victim, a target herself of online conspiracy theories. But here's the thing, is that if she was more experienced, she would know that that happens to everyone who is a public figure, and she is no different. But she wrote a book about it. She capitalized on it. And actually, I would argue that she created the content for her book because she targeted people. So people naturally responded very angrily, and that became content for her book. And I think that that's problematic because that's not impartial. She had a separate publishing deal of which she made plenty of money. And that was based on her work at the BBC. She was generating outrage against her, which she then turned into a book. That is not impartial. But I think the notion that Spring is where she is because she's an asset of the British state is not as far-fetched or implausible as it may sound. As I say, she actually, it was Cambridge University she went to, not Oxford. She, which again is in British terms, she's a former attendee of Oxbridge, which is the name given to people who attended two of our most so-called prestigious universities, Oxford and Cambridge. And it's not unusual for journalists to come through the Oxbridge route. Sadly, there is an overabundance of such people in British media. But Marianna Spring is marked out because she didn't work her way up. She was placed. She came from nowhere. She landed somewhere and now she's bloody everywhere. It is absolutely feasible that she is an agent working against the interests of the British people. Her entire backstory supports that. Yes, indeed it does. And I find her, frankly, loathsome. And what I also find loathsome is when she played on that whole victim narrative, the whole idea was, but she's so young. Listen, if she's old enough to be targeting people and creating problems within families and making people lose their livelihood, she is old enough to be critiqued herself. So I really loathe that thing of where they tried to play she's so young, don't criticize her. Sod that. And again, I think it's also highly possible that she was given that role because she was so young and they saw that as a good way. It was like a softener. It was like, oh, she's so young, she's learning. No, she's a problem. She's a pawn of the British establishment and she targets people. And what she does is not journalism. Absolutely not. It's asset work. That's what she does, in my opinion. And I believe we are still allowed opinions. So anyway, the BBC, well, from the get-go, the people in charge of the BBC have been establishment bods. I mean, that is a reality because the first board of governors after it became the British Broadcasting Corporation in 1927 was chaired by the Earl of Clarendon, former Tory chief whip of the House of Lords, also contained a former comptroller of the Bank of England, former headmaster of Winchester School, Ethel Snowdon, wife of the Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, and who actually was famous for cutting unemployment benefit in 1931. And that board set the pattern that was to follow, and nothing has changed. It is an establishment board even today. And I want to get around to this individual shortly. His name is Robbie Gibb. He's former head of BBC political programmes, former director of communications at Number 10 under Theresa May. He rejoined the BBC, I think it was about 2022, 2023, as board member for England. And I will be talking very shortly about Gibb and his extraordinary power very, very shortly. But the BBC has long been overstocked with overpaid and overhyped propagandists. Jeremy Vine, perfect example. Absolute big pharma pusher, COVID pusher, state agenda pusher. Vanessa Feltz was on the BBC for forever and a day. And although she's now kind of moved over to Channel 4, but she was on the BBC for, I think, decades. Earned an absolute fortune, obviously dyed in the wool Zionist and more state propagandist. The salaries at the BBC are obscene and absurd. They argue that if they call it talent, people who front shows they call talent, which is, I think in itself is the most disgusting term. They're trying to phase that out, but it's still known as that because it suggests that everybody else is not talented. But the salaries are infamously absurd. And so they argue that if this talent went on the open market, that they would earn much more. But that is a lie. And why don't we just test it anyway? But as an example, for 2024 to 2025, the BBC's best paid presenter has now just left, and that was Gary Lineker. He was paid £1.35 million. He ended up leaving when he started to speak out about the Middle East. the BBC is largely a Zionist playground and cannot tolerate that sort of stuff, as I will show you. And then there are people like Zoe Ball, who earns £515,000 a year. Now, Zoe Ball, Nepo baby. And honestly, I've never considered Zoe Ball a particularly good broadcaster. And people like Nick Robinson, 410,000, Fiona Bruce, 410,000, Stephen Nolan, 405,000. This is obscene stuff. Laura Kunsberg, 395,000. There is a scale. And most of them went up. Except Stephen Nolan went up from the previous year. Stephen Nolan remained the same, and Zoe Ball went slightly down. So she was on more than £515,000. And now she's obviously started to phase out of the BBC, although she's going to be appearing in different roles. And as I say, in terms of Gary Lineker, who was the highest paid presenter, he left because of this fallout to do with the Middle East and Zionism. And it brings me back to this man, Robbie Gibb. Sir Robert Paul Gibb, British public relations professional, former political advisor and broadcast journalist. He is the brother of Sir Nick Gibb, the former Conservative Member of Parliament for Bognor Regis and Littlehampton. After graduation, Robbie Gibb pursued a career as a journalist. His first role was as a political researcher at the BBC. He then became Chief of Staff for Conservative MP Francis Maude in the late 1990s. Gibb returned to the BBC first in 2002 as the deputy political editor of Newsnight, went on to edit various television programmes, including Daily Politics, The Andrew Marr Show, and This Week. And his interference in politics over the years cannot be underestimated. That has been mass broadcast to people. He was also Prime Minister Theresa May's Director of Communications between 2017 and 2019. He joined the BBC board as a non-executive director in 2021. He was appointed a Knight Bachelor on the 10th of September 2019 for political and public service. I bet. And because you know who recommends these Knight Bachelor appointments, right? Government. He served government very, very well from our major national broadcaster. He was reappointed as BBC board member for England, but there is a lot of conflict with Robbie Gibb. In 2020, Robbie Gibb led a consortium to buy the Jewish Chronicle, home of Zionism, if ever there was, like broadcasting home of Zionism. Gibb has refused to say who funded the consortium bid, which was believed to be around 3.5 million. But my guess is it was the Jewish lobby. And in his declaration of interest on the BBC website, Gibb stated that he owned 100% holding in Jewish Chronicle media. And Alan Rushbridger, who is the former editor of the Guardian, actually wrote in The Independent that Gibb had flatly ignored my questions about his role as the sole named director of the Jewish Chronicle, nor will he tell anyone whose money is behind the paper he owns, own in air quotes. And Gibb departed as director of the Jewish Chronicle on August the 20th, 2024, passing ownership to Jonathan Kandor, as a fellow consortium member, and the ex-Labour peer, Lord Austin of Dudley. And Gibb retained sole directorship of the JC Media and Culture Preservation Initiative, a community interest company sharing a correspondence address with the Jewish Chronicle. So it's as clear as mud what happened with Robbie Gibb and the Jewish Chronicle, and deliberately so. Gibb described himself as a Thatcherite conservative. He was an editorial advisor for GB News prior to its launch in 2021. GB News is unquestionably also a state asset media, unquestionably. At its kind of peak of employing conservative MPs, there were, I think it was like 5 to 7 Conservative MPs were employed by GB News. That cannot possibly be independent. And so Gibbs had a very interesting time. But I want to remind you of what I said about Emily Maitlis, how she's always across so much, right? And in August 2022, Emily Maitlis stated that Robbie Gibb was and I'm quoting her, an active agent of the Conservative Party who played a significant role in determining the nature of the corporation's news output. Now, that was interesting that she would say that, because she had been at the BBC forever and a day. I remember her as a young news reporter, like reporting for local London. And so she'd been there forever. So there's no way on earth that I'm going to believe she didn't know the origins of the BBC, right? So for her suddenly to say that Gibb is an active agent of the Conservative Party in 2022, well, that's the point. That is the point, because Emily, if you need reminding, the BBC was formed by government in order to be its media propaganda arm. And in July 2025, so this year, again, Gibb's impartiality was questioned in an open letter from over 400 media figures to the BBC, which stated, "We are concerned that an individual with close ties to the Jewish Chronicle has a say in the BBC's editorial decisions in any capacity, including the decision not to broadcast Gaza medics under fire." And some of the people who signed that was playwright Mike Lee, Alexei Sayle, Miriam Margolis, a number of people. And what they did was they delivered it on the eve of Channel 4 airing the documentary Gaza Doctors Under Attack, which the BBC had commissioned but shelved, as it said it risked creating a perception of partiality. Now, again, if you cannot be like partial in times of genocide, then what the hell is the purpose of you? Okay. And the letter alleges the decision to drop the film demonstrates once again that the BBC is not reporting without fear or favour when it comes to Israel. And that is the reality. And the letter accused Robbie Gibb of having a conflict of interest in Gaza. It accused the BBC of being crippled by the fear of being perceived as critical of the Israeli government. And it said that the inconsistent manner in which guidance is applied draws into focus the role of Gibb on the BBC board and BBC's editorial standards committee. And we are concerned that an individual with close ties to the Jewish Chronicle has a say in the BBC's editorial decisions. And of course, as I said, then by August, we heard that Gibb had relinquished his role in Jewish Chronicle, although none of it is entirely transparent about what has happened, what has taken place. But quite clearly, all of these people, these 400 signees, were alleging, and I agree with them, that Gibb has a conflict of interest, which highlights a double standard for BBC content makers who have themselves experienced censorship in the name of impartiality. So take a good look at him. I'm just going to take a glug of this. There were 111 BBC journalists who signed the letter, but they signed anonymously. So I'm not quite sure how you can sign a letter anonymously, but you can see why, because they were worried about losing their jobs. And the reality is, and I've heard this from BBC journalists, is that Robbie Gibb has long been someone of interest and of deep concern within the BBC. He is believed absolutely to shape programme making inside the corporation over the heads of the news executives who are charged with doing so. And he has been given this incredible freedom by BBC management to do so. He's, like, I think 27 is kind of the end of his tenure. But I think what's interesting is he's always been treated differently at the BBC. None of the other non-executives, by the way, are known to have addressed programme makers except Robbie Gibb. But it is important to note that Zionism is not the only BBC topic that is subject to favoritism, because gender, queer, trans and non-binary issues are as well. The BBC is very big on denying biological reality, and it will silence people who speak out. I was on the receiving end of that as one example. In 2019, I was dropped from being on the BBC's big Sunday show, The Big Question. And I was booked to appear, and I was dropped after tweeting about Britain's first transgender hate crime case. So what had happened was I'd been at court on the Friday witnessing Miranda Yardley, transsexual male, has never claim to be female at all, but was subject to a criminal charge at the hands of a woman, who was involved with the Mermaids charity. And it was actually dropped. It was kind of kicked out by the judge. Very astute judge who just saw that this was absolutely ridiculous. And I reported on it extensively on X, and BBC had already booked me, but and I reported on, as I say, on the Friday night and throughout, started Saturday morning. And by Saturday morning, I received a message that I was no longer wanted on the show. And what was very interesting to me about this, they of course denied the reason why, but what was very interesting to me about this was earlier in the week, I had recorded a conversation between myself and the BBC researcher who had booked me. And I said to her, you want me to appear on this show? And it was to talk about hate crime and various things like that. And my stance was very much that the whole idea of hate crime is being used to silence people, and they're using the whole kind of transgender agenda to do that. That's one of the ways that they're doing it. And I said to her, it is a known fact that people get cancelled on the BBC for holding similar views to myself. And she said, yes, it's true. If we have people on a panel and somebody is opposing what you have to say about the trans issues, or the person opposing it will be the one selected if we only need one person, right? And I got that on tape, but the BBC denied that had happened with me. Anyway, it was covered by the Mail on Sunday, by a number of newspapers, that they had dropped me because of this. And Nikki Campbell, who hosted the show, even went public and said, no, that isn't true. That's not what happened. Not at all. But that is what happened. That is what happened. That is the reality. Now, Nikki Campbell, I may not have been aware about it, but that is what happened behind the scenes. And I have the proof of that to a certain degree, because I told her in advance that I wouldn't be at all surprised that come the weekend you will drop me. And they did. So that's what happened. But BBC is absolutely up to its eyeballs, and has been for a significant period of time now, with the whole genderqueer lobby. And you can see that in its output. Look what they did to Doctor Who, for God's sake. Doctor Who was like a British tradition for a very, very long time, until Russell T Davies took over and queered up the whole thing. He brought in Kuti Gatwa in the lead role, and the idea was to increase queer representation on TV. And it's absolutely ridiculous. And they created all manner of queer characters. They had Rose Noble, trans-identified male, pansexual Captain Jack Harkness. They had a number of same-sex couples as well. And I don't oppose same-sex couples, obviously, clearly I don't. But Doctor Who was traditionally a children's program, and there is no reason. It's an agenda. Russell T Davies came with an agenda to queer up Doctor Who. And what's happened? The ratings have fallen. The ratings have fallen. And honestly, serves them right. Truly serves them right. And this week there was a report about how staff who are struggling with the Supreme Court ruling to do with the biological definition of women can work from home if they're uncertain about what toilets they can use. This is the fanning around that they do with staff at the BBC. At the last reckoning, there were over 500 people who identify as trans or non-binary at the BBC. And so what happened was, in June of this year, I'm sure you remember, I've reported on it on Wake Up, the Supreme Court ruled that the definition of women was not based on gender, but on biology, and that is adult human female. Now, this was not a new law. This already exists in the Equality Act. But the BBC is one of those organizations that thinks it's perfectly okay for men who identify as women to use the female loos. And so there's been this whole hoo-ha at the BBC. And the BBC said they're waiting for the government to rule on this. What do you need government to rule on? Men and women are entitled to have single-sex spaces according to the Equality Act. So you shouldn't need the government to rule on it. Anyway, as I say, the BBC fanning around the whole issue of trans and non-binary. They have said that even though there are self-contained facilities and mixed-sex toilets at most of its sites, staff who have concerns about which toilet they should be using may be able to work from home as a solution while it awaits government guidance. I'm so over all of this. I'm so over all of this. And this infantilization of people, it's very, very clear. And that is, there are mixed sex toilets, right? But the problem is, and there's no way that the BBC don't know this. The problem is that these males who identify as females, they don't want to use mixed sex toilets. They want to rampage in female toilets because they are autogynephiles, and part of the issue of being an autogynephile is you are aroused by the idea of being perceived as the opposite sex, and so it's just absolutely ridiculous. So the people who fund the BBC license are essentially bankrolling this stay-at-home culture because the BBC are infantilizing their staff to make going to toilet an issue. I mean, just ridiculous. And you know what? When I was researching today's show, and a lot of the stuff that I'm saying, because Wake Up we have such savvy, sussed viewers. So a lot of the stuff that I will be talking about today and have already talked about, our viewers will already know. But one of the reasons I like to do these kind of wake up deep dives is to bring it all together, because oftentimes you have this isolated piece of information and that isolated piece of information, but these deep dives are intended to make it all one kind of whole compact video that can be shared. And it was interesting because when I was going through the research and kind of pulling it all together for today's show, one name kept cropping up, and it was, I mean, let me see if I can bring her in, because this woman was deemed a major problem when I was growing up. And now I understand why she was so seriously and significantly demonized by the BBC. I wonder if I do have a picture of her. It's Mary Whitehouse. And here she is, dear Mary Whitehouse. So when I was growing up, the mention of Mary Whitehouse was like, oh God, she's a disgusting human being who wants to silence us all and everything. But actually, from my position where I am now, she was trying to save us. She absolutely was. And they demonized her. She had a 1964 Clean Up TV campaign. And in her view, Hugh Green, who was the BBC Director General at the time, was, in quotes, more than anybody else responsible for the moral collapse in this country. Mary Whitehouse knew. Her campaign became known as the National Viewers and Listeners Association. And she was opposed to a lot of the stuff that the BBC were bringing through. She saw it as, excuse me, let me just clean up my nose. This is what it's like when you're doing live, right? She saw the BBC as a place of degeneracy, and she was absolutely right. And even though she had a problem with other TV broadcasters, her focus was primarily on the BBC. But as I say, spot on, children have been at risk from the BBC. Not only at risk, they've been abused on BBC premises. And it's not just the violent, obscene videos that children at the BBC have been risked, but by the predators within. But yeah, Mary Whitehouse, they did a good job on her, demonizing her. As I say, I associated her with all things that were wrong. She wanted to silence us, that she didn't want us to have free speech. She didn't want us to be entertained. All of this stuff, they did a fantastic job in demonizing her because she was a force to be reckoned with. More power to your elbow. Rest in peace, Mary Whitehouse. There's some of her stuff I absolutely would not have agreed with, you know, some of her political ideas. But on the BBC, 100%. Now, before I get to the predator part of this research, and for those who are unfamiliar, it's important that we know what is at the front of the BBC building. Absolutely vital and important that we do. It is the Prospero and Ariel statue. It's been on display at the BBC since 1933. And for those who are unfamiliar, it's despite the attacks that it has endured, despite protests, despite petitions and pleas to the various BBC Director Generals, they have made it clear, excuse me, that no matter what, this statue will remain in place. This statue was created by the man in the image. His name is Eric Gill. And Eric Gill, after his death in 1940, his diaries revealed that he had abused his daughters, his sisters, and the family dog. And the BBC has been, I mean, subject to so many people coming out against this statue because it's a horrific statue. And by the way, what he did, just to show how perverse this man was that he elongated this. So the image of Arion Prospero is associated with broadcasting. So on that, you say, oh, yeah, OK, I can see why it's on the front of Broadcasting House. But there's more to it than that. Obviously, this was a deeply disturbed, abusive predator. And Sir John Leith, as I say, commissioned him to do this. And it was so perverse that he elongated the penis on the child from the original illustrations. And we often talk about Eric Gill, and not least because his font is still in circulation, right? Gill Sans. I never use it. I don't think it should be available at all, but it is still in circulation. But anyway, this statue has been subject to so much controversy, but they restored it after attack. So it was attacked twice. And the BBC said that the estimated cost of the restoration and work after attack was £529,715. And it's so mealy-mouthed because the BBC say it's understood that the cost has been covered by the BBC rather than claimed on insurance. Well, I have a very good source who claims it was actually Westminster Council who fronted up the cost of restoration for this. And the man who attacked it twice, David Chick of Northamptonshire, pleaded not guilty to causing more than 150,000 worth of damage in May 2023. He was already under investigation for criminal damage to the same statue during a previous incident in 2022. And in March of this year, the judge released David on conditional bail and ordered him not to go within 100 meters of the statue. And a trial for David Chick has been set for May 2026 at Southwark Crown Court. I absolutely intend to be there. And so Gill's statue and the extreme protection of it acts as a metaphor for how the BBC has protected its in-house nonces. That is the reality. The BBC is the home of wrong-uns and is a supporter of wrong-uns from the start. And let me see if I can bring in some of these images as well. Like when you look at the Beeb magazine as one example, right? Beeb magazine for children, very popular magazine. And you had people like, now look, you can't blame people for what happened in hindsight. I'm sorry, I still need to, I'm just going to go off camera slightly so I can just clean my nose properly. Excuse me. There we go. Sorry, this is live. You know how it goes. Right. So obviously we can't blame the BBC per se for putting Gary Glitter, who was later revealed to be an extensive predator. But Gary Glitter was somebody that the BBC supported and says so much about what was wrong with the BBC. This had a number of convictions at the BBC, by the way, including Stuart Hall, including Huw Edwards. But this is just one example of their support for predators. And Jimmy Savile. Where would we be without mentioning Jimmy Savile, for goodness sake? Sir James Wilson Vincent Savile, English media personality, DJ, best known for hosting BBC shows such as Top of the Pops and Jim Will Fix It. After his death, hundreds of allegations of sexual abuse surfaced and led to a conclusion that he was a predatory sex offender and possibly one of Britain's most prolific. They avoided the fact that he was a very treasured member of the British establishment with a deep friendship to the current king. I mean, just as an aside, by the way, if everybody's kicking off about Andrew, what about Charles? Charles has spent a lifetime surrounded by predators, as I've done in a deep dive. But yeah, Jimmy Savile, the official story is that he was an extensive predator that was allowed to operate with impunity. But they don't talk about his establishment links, how he was a close friend to Margaret Thatcher, the then British Prime Minister, or King Charles, or indeed almost all the royal family. They don't talk about that. But he was able to operate with impunity from the BBC. He abused people at the BBC. There were at least 5 managers who were aware of what he had done. And we then heard that that Jimmy Savile had also abused within the NHS and schools, or a number of places. And the thing is that the BBC did everything they could to cover up what Jimmy Savile had done. So in 2011, the BBC's Newsnight programme very controversially decided to drop a report exposing Jimmy Savile as a serial sexual abuser. And the decision was found to be flawed, was certainly flawed. An independent inquiry took place to look into it, though the independent inquiry, hardy-ha, cleared the BBC of allegations of a high-level cover-up. Of course it would, but let me tell you a little bit about it because I think it's interesting. So in late 2011, following Savile's death, the Newsnight team began investigating persistent rumours of Savile's sexual misconduct. And reporters Liz McKean and Marianna Jones uncovered credible and compelling evidence. Marianna Jones, I think it was his auntie, who had a school for troubled girls, where Savile would go and then take girls out in his car for drives. And so Marianna Jones had first-hand knowledge of some of Jimmy Savile's exploits. And with Liz McKean at the BBC, they, kind of put together this work, and they intended to air the story before Christmas, but the report was dropped in early December by the programme's editor, Peter Rippon. And what happened in place of this was the BBC then ran a series of tribute shows to Savile to air over the Christmas holidays, right? As I say, quote unquote, an independent report later revealed that McKean and Jones' evidence included allegations of abuse on BBC premises and from women who had not previously spoken to the police. After the BBC's decision became public, the editor, Peter Rippon, published a blog claiming the story was dropped for editorial reasons such as insufficient evidence and the fact that an earlier police investigation had not led to charges. And Rippon's blog post was found to contain a number of factual inaccuracies and incomplete information. Reporters McKean and Jones publicly disagreed with Rippon's editorial decision, with Marianna Jones warning Rippon via email that the BBC would be accused of a cover-up. Quite rightly, it was a cover-up, 100%. And this conflict led to allegations of internal suppression of the story. They did internally suppress it because Jimmy Savile was not only enabled by the BBC, but made a ton of money for them. They don't want to lose that ton of money. There was a Pollard report, which was released in December 2012, that concluded the decision to drop the report was flawed, but was made in good faith. And it found no evidence, as I say, of a high-level conspiracy or cover-up. What bunkum. And interestingly, for many people, 5 years later, Liz McKean was said to have died from a stroke. Many people still question that. She was reported to have died on August the 18th, 2017. So we've never got to hear fully, kind of like with the passage of time, some of her thoughts on BBC operations and its approach to its predators. And I would very much have liked to have heard that, because she was somebody who had insider knowledge and was prepared to whistleblow on it. But I also could see how the BBC was shaping and changing what was happening in terms of establishment paedophiles. And the way that they did it was with this fella. Let me just show you. Very curious stuff that took place. And I'm sure you all remember all this. But as a consequence of what happened with Sir Cliff Richard, the BBC changed reporting of, as I say, establishment and famous allegations. So what happened? Cliff Richard was for many years a BBC asset. He had his own BBC TV variety show. It's Cliff Richard. It ran for 4 years from 1970. He was also featured in numerous BBC specials and series like Sir Cliff Richard at the BBC, Songs of Praise and Good Morning Sunday, alongside appearances on shows like Desert Island Discs. He was an absolute BBC asset, for want of a better description. But what happened, and it was very interesting, was that Cliff Richard ended up very successfully suing the BBC for invasion of privacy after they filmed and reported on a police raid on his home in 2014. It was part of an investigation into sexual assault allegations against him. He was never arrested or charged. And in 2018, a High Court judge ruled that the BBC infringed his privacy rights, awarding him damages and ordering the BBC and South Yorkshire Police to pay significant large costs, with a final settlement of around £2 million paid by the BBC in 2019. And the case led to new legal precedents for suspects and their privacy, and led Cliff Richard to campaign for laws for those accused of sexual offences. But it did so much more than that. It sent a warning shot to other broadcasters that you are going too far in looking at allegations of establishment abuse. And it was extraordinary what they did. So Cliff Richard wasn't even at home. He was in his apartment abroad. I think it might have been Spain or somewhere thereabouts, but he wasn't at home. And this was in Sunningdale in Berkshire. And the police did a live raid on BBC TV. There's no other way to describe it, right? They had helicopters filming, and I have never seen anything like that. And when I saw it, I was like, this is a setup. This is a setup. Now, bear in mind, as I say, Sir Cliff Richard, longtime BBC asset. And Cliff Richard has been subject to many allegations over the years, many allegations over the years, none of them proven, and he's never been charged. But I remember having a conversation. I was a consulting and contributing editor at ITN for 8 years, and a lot of my work involved looking at establishment abuse. And I remember having a conversation with an editor about this bust. Sorry, I'm so sorry about this. I remember having a conversation with an editor about this bust of Cliff Richard, and her saying that changes it all. That changes it all. It was a warning shot to broadcasters to back the F off. That's what it was. And it did. Laws were changed. I mean, it changed broadcasting. People didn't want to look anymore at whether politicians had been involved in high-level cover-up of abuse, because Cliff Richard had for many years been linked with politicians and allegations of abuse. Again, as I say, nothing proven, no convictions. But when they did that live bust on his home, I knew that that was a setup. And very successfully so, because everything changed after that. And within no time at all, you could not get a commissioning editor to agree to cover really anything in terms of establishment abuse. So job well done, frankly, job well done. And of course, where would we be without mentioning him again? The man who announced the death of the Queen and who narrated the King's coronation was found himself to be a filthy predator. He was establishment media with bells on. You do not get chosen to announce the Queen's death or to narrate the coronation unless you are establishment hack through and through. In July 2024, Edwards pleaded guilty to making 41 indecent images of children. He admitted to keeping 7 category A images of the very worst kind on his phone. You can't get worse than category A. He had been sent them on WhatsApp by a paedo, and they were of children between the ages of 7 and 14. It's extraordinary. He had a very glittering 4-decade-long career at the BBC, but the signs were all there. New people who started at the BBC in the newsroom were told to laugh at his jokes and not to question him, that it was important that he felt like he was the most intelligent, most well-informed person in the news team, and people were told not to challenge him. Anyway, He was also outed. This wasn't the court case, but he was outed for giving tens of thousands of pounds to a drug addicted teenager in exchange for sexual pictures. And then he was eventually convicted for receiving and having these child abuse images. He was handed a 6-month prison sentence, suspended for 2 years, of course, after he admitted having the indecent images. And as I say, these were separate from the allegations of him funding the drug habit of a teenager. And aside from the fact that it's absolutely disgusting, such a predator, I mean, really, if there's any indication that if somebody is in such a superior position anywhere, that we should question quite why they've got there, Huw Edwards is a perfect example of that. He was seen as the epitome of respectable media, of respectable journalism. And yet in the background, he was nothing but a filthy predator, filthy, disgusting child abuse predator. And you know that we can't legally call him a pedo because he hasn't been done for being a pedo. And one of the reasons why they give suspended sentences to people who have child abuse images is because they're not categorized as pedophiles, which in my opinion actually is outrageous. They create the market, they make it possible for the abuse of these children, and Huw Edwards is no different. But what added to that was the fact that Huw Edwards refused to give back his £200,000 salary that he had received between his arrest and when he resigned from the BBC. And the BBC chairman, Samir Shah, appeared before the Culture, Media and Sport Committee and said that he was refusing to give his money back. I find that extraordinary. How can the BBC not have contractually that if you bring down the name of the corporation in some way, then you will be fined in some way by the corporation? But the idea that he was allowed to keep this £200,000 salary, I think, is absolutely egregious, and still, to my knowledge, has refused to repay it. But there was more about the complicity of the BBC that was taking place, because an hour before he was sentenced on the 16th of September for making those images, BBC Director General Tim Davie received an email which warned that a complaint was made about Huw Edwards as far back as 2012. And of course, guess what? Nothing was done about it. And the email came from a former BBC employee who said he wished to personally and potentially flag an area of risk to the corporation that you may not be previously aware of. They said a complaint had been made against Edwards, adding, "The reason for my email to you is just to flag that there is a high probability that this complaint was documented somewhere, but was, by recollection, to have been deemed non-actionable." And the ex-employee stressed that this was not necessarily a criminal allegation, and I have no real specifics I can offer you other than it exists. Well, that was significant enough and came from a substantial enough source that Tim Davie replied 3 minutes later. Okay, you have to be somebody substantial if he's replying within 3 minutes. And he confirmed that he would share it with the team investigating past allegations. But, you know, the reality is allegations against Huw Edwards were being made at least a decade before the BBC were forced to act. And they even, you know what they did, right? The parents of the teen who was receiving the money for Huw Edwards went to the BBC and complained to the BBC, and they refused to act. So the parents felt they had no choice whatsoever but then to go to tabloid media. And they went to tabloid media, and I don't know if you remember this when it was happening. They went to tabloid media, and it came out that there was a BBC presenter who had been doing this, but no name was released. And then eventually, I thought this was quite interesting, it was actually Huw Edwards' wife who gave up his name as being the person at the center of it. Wife, it's Huw. They're now divorced. I'm sure that's not a shocker to people, not at all. I couldn't stand Huw Edwards even before this. He was a lockdown pusher, major lockdown narrative. And yet it was also alleged that he had breached lockdown rules several times, including to meet a 23-year-old stranger from a dating site, while the BBC was at the same time telling millions of people to follow the rules as part of its fear-mongering campaign. And, I think it's astonishing that Huw Edwards got to the point where he was able to resign from the BBC. I think that tells you so much about the culture of the BBC. Remember what I said, propaganda and predators. Yes, indeedy, propaganda and predators. And that is the reality. And guess who crops up in this story? Emily Maitlis. She came out. She was blasting BBC reporters for what she deemed distasteful reporting of allegations against Huw Edwards instead of going to HR. And she said that she was surprised that the broadcaster continued to investigate while vulnerable presenter is in hospital, because he was then hospitalized after all of this came out. Before he was convicted and charged, but when it all came out that he was giving money to this teen drug addict, we then heard that he was hospitalized. So Emily Maitlis then came out and saying it was distasteful reporting and everything. Yeah, we got you, Emily. We got you. Yeah, we have. So Emily Maitlis, long time at the BBC, defending him. But the BBC has all manner of issues and convictions amongst its former staff. Numerous BBC employees and on-air personalities have been convicted of serious crimes, including sexual offences against children and adults, stalking and making indecent images of children. So you have Huw Edwards as one example. Then there's the whole issue of Jimmy Savile, who was never charged because he had the police in his pocket and the establishment. And he used to have his Friday morning club where the police from the local Nick would come around, his handshaky Freemasonry friends. Then there was Rolf Harris, who was convicted in 2014 of 12 counts of indecently assaulting girls. Stuart Hall, convicted in 2013 and 2014 of sexually abusing young girls and women, with crimes spanning several decades. You had Chris Denning, radio DJ, pleaded guilty to 21 child sex offences in 2016 and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. It goes on and on. There was also Jonathan King as one example. I know Jonathan King is really big on pleading his innocence these days. But he was convicted at one stage. So there's loads of stuff that the BBC have permitted that is absolutely reprehensible and disgusting. And I mean, I've catalogued a lot of it here and now, but I tell you, one of the things that still sticks in my craw, as they say, and it involved actually a man who's currently in one of the BBC's leading programs. And have I got it here? Yes, I have. It involved Russell Brand and Jonathan Ross. And Jonathan Ross, as I say, has been back on the BBC for The Popular Traitors, or I think he's now been voted out. But what happened was in 2008, the scandal known as Sachsgate. So Russell Brand had his BBC Radio 2 show, and together with Jonathan Ross, they sent an answer phone message which was recorded and passed by BBC editors and aired. And it was an answer phone message which was sent to Andrew Sachs, who used to be in Fawlty Towers. And it was about Andrew Sachs' granddaughter, Georgina Bailey, who Russell Brand used to have something of a relationship with. And they left this answer phone message to her granddad, and it aired on the BBC network. And it was absolutely obscene. At one point, Jonathan Ross shouted, "He effed your granddaughter," into the phone. And Andrew Sachs was not aware of the call until a reporter from the Mail on Sunday informed him. He said he was offended very much indeed. The broadcast was hugely distressing to his family. And the pre-recorded message, important to keep repeating that, was approved by a BBC executive. It was broadcast on October the 18th, 2008. Initial reaction to it was minimal, but then it all kicked off. Then there was widespread media coverage about it. Both Brand and Ross were suspended. Brand resigned. Ross didn't even have the decency to do that. The broadcast regulator Ofcom fined the BBC £150,000 for broadcasting the offensive and humiliating material. But the point is, it was pre-recorded. The editors knew what it said, and they still put it out. And they still promote Jonathan Ross to this day. So you can do that. Do you imagine? Put yourself in those shoes, because some people, they become quite distant when it involves famous people. But imagine being a grandfather, receiving a call about somebody effing your granddaughter, and it's broadcast across the BBC network. That would be so humiliating. It had such a damaging impact that grandfather and granddaughter did not speak for years. Absolutely egregious, outrageous stuff. It's disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. So there's a million things that I will never, ever forgive the BBC for. And by the way, I think this is absolutely the point. When this was bought for me by a friend outside the BBC, is it true? Or did you hear it on the BBC? That's one of my favorite T-shirts. And we actually bought that. Well, I didn't buy it. My friend bought it for me outside the BBC in Portland Place. Actually, just close by where the paedo statue is. So I think I've outlined quite clearly, right, that the BBC is absolutely a government propaganda arm. It stands as a testimony, not only for propaganda, but as the media for a dumbed down nation, right? We have more ways to watch programs than ever before, and yet we have not revolted en masse to ban the license. And I find that really alarming, given everything that we know. They have literally enabled child abuse at the BBC. They've enabled egregious acts of treason against the British public, including the lying C19 narrative. And the odd thing is, people will fight you for it to carry on. They have been sold the lie that it's part of our cultural heritage and it's a tradition that must continue, but it mustn't. It's outdated, it's outmoded, it has no place in modern society. It's an elitist establishment that promotes its own type to the top echelons of the BBC and continues to spy on us while feeding us a steady glut of government propaganda. The only good thing they do, and they do this excellently actually, is the drama that they do. But the bottom line is the BBC needs to self-fund. It's like a child that never grew up and expects us to indulge its every whim and fetish without taking any responsibility. And it's time to take the sodding dummy out of its mouth and make it pay its own way. See how long it survives then. See if it really can work with market forces. So absolutely, today's programme is another call to defund the BBC. Let them fund themselves. They doubled down on their protection of their Eric Gill paedo statue, something, again, that I will never forgive them for. And there are discussions currently taking place between Parliament and the BBC about how to manage the growth of the channels, about alternative funding ways. But whatever they decide, the British public must not be made to fund it. And that includes the propaganda broadcasts that are broadcast to 42 countries. Okay? It's elitist. It's anti-working class. It promotes the establishment. It is a state broadcaster. And I can't put this any simply. If you buy a TV license, then you are responsible not only for funding traitorous propaganda against the people, but you have also funded predatory behavior. It is a system that rewards incompetence and nepotism and so much that is wrong in our society. And you, the license payer, are responsible for that largely. Yes, you are. So defund the BBC, make it stand on its own 2 feet. We have babied it for too long, and it's time to call it a day. And that is my feeling on it. I'm done with it. I've been done with it for a very long time. I find it astonishing that people continue to support it the way that they do. And Rich said, TV people hype themselves up like TV is needed for survival. And Rich, they also do this thing where media eats itself, right? And that is something that's reported in a newspaper is then taken and reported on TV. Oh, is that true, Lord Jaws? I've not had a TV for 20 years and I haven't missed it one bit. Now, we have a TV, but we don't watch TV on it, right? Biased brainwashing corp. We need more of this, says Ian. Yes, tell vision, right? Program mind control. It is, of course, it's one of the easiest ways to mind control the population. Randy says we are doomed in Denmark. Please help us. Inside our robotic ignorance, we are basically kind people. We've been groomed from the beginning. JC Cummings still haven't watched TV in years and years, and it's brilliant. Yeah, because it's not what they do is not called programming for no good reason, right? And Jacqueline is watching me on her TV because you can do that. Yes, you can. So thank you for being here today, as ever. I appreciate you. I appreciate you and all your kindness. Thank you for your super chats. Very much appreciated. Thank you, Rosaline. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul Trainer. Thank you, Paul Carden, who wrote, in the 1982 Falklands War, the Daily Mail did a headline. Oh, this is about Andrew. This is about Prince Andrew. Got you. Andrew decoys Exeter. Prince Andrew never corrected them and let this lie stand for decades. Paul is not happy about Prince Andrew, and so say all of us. But without the BBC, the British royal family almost certainly wouldn't be able to stand as long as it has. That's the reality. And thank you again, Sticky Marks. I appreciate all of you very, very much on the super chat. And on Monday, here's my patrons. Thank you, my patrons. You are indeed brilliant, amazing. On Monday, we will look at the royal chaos that is taking place. We'll also be looking at the food stamp crisis in the US. And we'll have a round table with the content creators who were recently demonized in a Channel 4 documentary about Brit lad Jay Slater. So all that and more on Monday's show. In the meantime, I just want to thank you for being here, for listening, for liking, sharing, subscribing, even though those are all the names of my Patreons who I appreciate greatly, magnificently. And I appreciate every which way that people contribute to Wake Up. I truly do. Thank you. And if you're not able to financially contribute, then like, share and subscribe is also fabulous. Thank you so much. So beautiful people, I will see you on Monday, 9 a.m. GMT. Be there or be square, as they used to say about 40 years ago. Have a fantastic weekend. Take good care of yourself. And you know what you have to do, right? Defund the BBC. Take care. See you Monday.